Welcome to RuralStrong, where we talk real challenges and bold solutions in rural economic development. I'm your host, Joe Barker. Let's get into it. Welcome to RuralStrong. This is your podcast host, Joe Barker, and we're broadcasting today from the Southwest Tennessee Development District podcast studio in beautiful downtown Jackson, Tennessee. And for all you planners out there, we've got a special guest today. Our guest is Josh Suddath, who is the inaugural Executive Director of the Center for Local Planning at the University of Tennessee Institute for Public Service. Josh has been on the job about a year now. He assumed the role in October of last year, and he leads a state-funded program designed to assist Tennessee cities and counties with infrastructure planning, zoning, and navigating rapid economic development. Josh, welcome to RuralStrong.
Thank you for having me, Joe. I appreciate you having me come in today.
Well, Josh and myself, since he's been on the job, have met several times, and our organization is involved in local planning. And I know we've got people that listen to RuralStrong on a regular basis that are involved in planning in all areas of land use planning and other planning. And Josh, maybe to start off with, tell the folks a little bit about your background and really what has brought you to the position you're in today.
Yes, sir. Well, so I'm a native West Tennessean. So I'm originally from Weakley County, Tennessee. I grew up just outside of Gleason in a little unincorporated area called Pillaville, Tennessee, is where I grew up.
Now, is that where they made My Pillow?
I don't think so.
Don't think so.
I don't
okay.
recall. There's not much of an industrial base in Pillaville.
Okay.
At least there wasn't when I grew up there. But I went to Gleason School. After I graduated from high school there, went to the Marine Corps and served about 4.5 years in the military. And after that, took advantage of those GI Bill benefits and ended up at ETSU out in Johnson City, Tennessee, where I got my bachelor's degree and then my master's in planning and development, planning and economic development, and did internships and all that stuff, to get my feet wet. And I got my first big boy job, as I call it, in the town of Collierville out in West Tennessee in Shelby County, where I worked as an assistant town administrator out there is where I ended up working up to. Spent about 6 years there, transitioned to state government, and worked for a couple of years at TDOT managing a statewide transportation planning program there called the Office of Community Transportation. Following that experience, I got to know Mayor Anthony Holt, or during that experience, I got to know him at MPO meetings, Metropolitan Planning Organization meetings, and came on board as his Director of Planning and Engineering, and spent about 7.5 years in Sumner County, heading up that effort. And if you know Sumner County, it's one of the more rapidly growing counties in the state. I think it's 6th or 7th fastest growing in the last census in the state of Tennessee. And from there, this position came up with the University of Tennessee, and like you said, I've been on board for about 8 or 9 months now. Still very much in the getting my feet wet stage, and meeting folks across the state and working with the development districts and cities and counties and figuring out what the needs are and helping out as we can. We're building staff right now, and things are going pretty well so far.
Well, great. I always wondered, Josh. I think planners are unique people, and I've worked with planners all my life. What was your interest that made you want to go into the planning field?
Well, my wife has actually asked me that question before. She says, "How does somebody that grew up where you grew up end up in city planning?" And it's a good question, and it's one of those things that I think a lot of folks, if you talk to the average citizen in the street, whether they live in a city or out in the country somewhere, they probably are not aware that the profession exists at all, to be honest with you. And the ones that do are maybe the folks that have done development or dealt with, building projects and those kinds of things. And so what attracted me to it was the fact that as a profession, it's a place that you can work, and it's very complicated. Anybody that's done it for any length of time can tell you it's very complicated. It's very rules-based. It's very orderly in a lot of ways, but it's an opportunity really to make a difference. It really is. It's an opportunity to you're not a decision maker when you're a planner most of the time, except for in very small circumstances. In general, you're working with people who have been elected by the people of that community to be the decision makers. And so you're working with them to help them a lot of times accomplish their vision. And so that was something that really attracted me to the profession, is it's an opportunity to help people. And that's, to help the elected officials, as I said, to achieve their vision that they have for the community that they've been elected to lead. But it's an opportunity to help citizens. It's an opportunity to help the community. It's an opportunity to help people get projects done and have a voice in shaping their community. And that's the ideal of local planning is it's not just hearing from the people at the top of the pyramid as far as elected officials and those kinds of things. It's a grassroots based kind of a way of doing things where you're taking that public input in and you're building a vision for the community. And all that was really, after my military service particularly, it was something that really appealed to me.
Let me ask you, Josh, planning is one of those professions where not everybody believes that you should have professional planners, and there's always a controversy about how important it is to a community. In your view, and let's talk primarily about rural communities, why is planning so important for a rural community?
Well, I try to explain it in that a lot of the times with local communities, by the time that they realize that they need that professional planner, or the time that they realize that they need to get their regulations in place and deal with growth has already happened a lot of the times, And so what happens is, and this has happened in every community I've ever worked in, the history is, they experience a lot of growth that they really weren't prepared for. And a lot of problems come about as far as drainage, particularly. You have drainage issues, you have traffic issues, you have any number of infrastructure, water, sewer issues, where there wasn't a lot of thought that went into the growth that occurred on the front end. And so you spend the next 30, 40, 50 years trying to fix it. And so my advice to folks is, they say an ounce of cure is worth a pound of prevention. Or maybe it's the opposite. An ounce
I think
of
it is the opposite, but we know what you're saying.
An ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure, I guess. That getting that professional staff, whether they work for the city and they're on the payroll or they're with a development district like with you guys, having that professional staff on board in some way to assist communities with dealing with that growth while it's happening, while it's proposed, to help shape it with those decision makers at the council level and the planning commission level. That's incredibly important. And it's worth and I really do advocate for the profession that it is worth the investment. It's an investment that a community has to make in itself, but it is something that pays a lot of dividends. But it's not something that the dividends, they don't come in right away. So it's hard to measure them sometimes, because the dividends come in down the road when you don't have drainage problems, or you don't have traffic problems, or you don't have infrastructure problems like water and sewer. And so it's hard to put a number on that, but I've seen it happen, and I'm a big proponent of that investment for local communities, rural or urban.
Josh, I ran for my first public office when I was 24 years old, and I got elected to the Savannah, Tennessee City Council. And I never will forget the very first meeting I attended. At the end of the meeting, there were some board appointments, and the mayor was making these appointments, and there was a vacancy on the planning committee. And he appointed me to serve on the planning committee. And I'm going to be honest with you, I knew nothing about planning, and I left that night and I thought, the mayor thinks a lot of me. My first meeting, he puts me on this planning committee, and it didn't take me long to figure out nobody else wanted to be on the planning committee, and I was the one there that didn't know better, and so they appointed me because, as you said, planning can be controversial.
It can be very controversial. It's complicated, controversial, and the job of the planning commissioner is a thankless task most of the time. It's one where you're being asked to make. Sometimes it's recommendations, sometimes it's decisions, and the amount of discretion that local planning commissioner has. Again, your average citizen does not understand that these are not a lot of dictators that are sitting there that can just make decisions at will. They're bound by the regulations. And so having good regulations is very important for those folks.
Well, I used to make the analogy that it was like serving on the planning commission. You know, it's like your children. You can correct them, but you don't want anybody else correcting your children. And people look on that with their property. It's my property, and I don't want anyone telling me what I can do with my property. And the other thing, and I just want to get your thoughts on this, sometimes I think local elected officials planning is not at the top of their list of priorities. And then we all know they've got a lot of things they have to deal with. And as you said, most of the time, a planner makes recommendations, and then the board, the council, whoever makes the final decision. How important, Josh, is it for those local elected officials, I guess, to be educated and trained on how important planning really is?
It's hard to overstate how important that is. Those decisions that those local officials make, again, like I said, the reality of it is that they are bound by the regulations they have on the books and things like case law and what state law says they can and can't do and those kinds of things. And so when you have local officials who maybe don't really understand that, haven't received the education to know what the rules are, the rules of the road before they're out there making these decisions. That's when communities can run into a lot of liability. They can run into a lot of issues where they've done things that a judge might deem to be unconstitutional, where property is being taken without due process, or people's rights are being violated in terms of the process that's outlined in the regulations being followed. And so having that training is crucial. It's crucial to a planning commission running well. And, they could be training on parliamentary procedure, Robert's Rules of Order, just how to run a meeting. That's very important as well. But the constitutional basis for zoning and land use rules and those kinds of things. And then, everything else, floodplain administration, all the little details. It's a whole universe of things that these folks, who a lot of times are unpaid, are very low, very not paid very little to serve on these boards. It's a whole universe of things that they have to know, and that they're ultimately held responsible for knowing if they don't know it. And so at the University of Tennessee, what I tell folks, with the Center for Local Planning, our role, we are not here to tell anybody what to do. We're not in the regulatory business in any way, but University of Tennessee for sure is in the education business. And so I look at our core mission, as much as anything else that we're charged with doing, is to help facilitate getting information out there to the local communities on what the rules of the road are, because that's a discussion point I've heard from a lot of members of the development community across the state. Is there's the same rule book at the state level, but locally it seems like everybody reads it a whole lot of different ways, and there's not a lot of consistency. And so we strive to help everybody in the state understand what the rules are, what the state legislature has put in the toolbox for communities to use to deal with the growth that a lot of Tennessee is dealing with.
And I want to segue into UT and their involvement, in local planning. But to give our folks a little context, for years in the state of Tennessee, there was a Department of Local Planning that came under the Tennessee Department of Economic and Community Development. And this planning department contracted with cities and counties to provide services. And then I guess 15, 16 years ago, administrations changed. There was a decision made that the state of Tennessee was going to get out of the local planning business. And at that time, of course, cities and counties saw the importance of it, and they wanted to, number one, lots of them wanted to keep the planner that they had for years. So that's when the development districts in Tennessee got involved. A lot of us actually hired planners that worked for the state of Tennessee. And so that's how this has operated in Tennessee. for the past number of years. Of course, there's always been private contractors out there that provide those services. And then, if you're large enough and have the financial wherewithal, then a lot of cities and counties hire their own planners. That leads into why UT? Why did UT think that they needed to enter the planning arena?
Well, I believe the way the discussion went was, like you said, of course, the state planning office had gone away. Development districts had done a phenomenal job of stepping into the breach and filling a big portion of what that old state planning office used to do in terms of staffing planning commissions, staffing boards of zoning appeals, reviewing site plans and plats and rezoning requests and those kinds of things. But there's a whole other set of things that the state planning office used to do in terms of comprehensive growth planning for communities across the state. As you know, there's a planning requirement for counties and all the cities in the state. Things like policy guidance, when the state legislature would come out with some kind of a new rule or law that everybody had to comply with. There was some uniform guidance and model ordinances across the state that would be put out. There's an education component that went away to some extent across a lot of the state. Still being done to some extent in some places, but not to the extent that it probably was back then. And so the issue, though, that really galvanized, I think, a lot of the discussion when it comes to UT and the Center for Local Planning was really around the topic of farm loss, agricultural loss across the state to development, where farmland has been converted to other uses, residential and commercial development primarily. And so the Department of Agriculture several years ago convened a working group that had TML, Tennessee Municipal League, the County Mayors Association, UT, a number of other Farm Bureau, a number of other organizations were on that working group. To brainstorm ideas on how to get their arms around the topic of farm loss, because the numbers that were put out there and that I've seen most recently were, by 2027, for the period from 1997 to 2027, about 2 million acres of farmland have been lost across the state of Tennessee to development. And so that's the equivalent of roughly about 4 counties that have been lost to development. And so Commissioner Hatcher, who was the commissioner at the time, tasked this working group with coming up with some potential solutions for ways to work on that issue. And so the couple of ideas came out of the working group, one of which was a landowner education program. There's a separate bill that was done by the General Assembly a year or two ago, Farmland Preservation Bill, I believe is what it's called, where essentially the state compensates property owners for putting in a conservation easement. There was about $30 million that was set aside there, and there's a public education program that surrounds that. So that was one priority. And the other was establishment of a local planning office to again start providing direct assistance to local communities across the state on issues related to planning and development. And so I think the discussion on where to put that, UT emerged as a pretty logical choice for that because the UT, University of Tennessee Institute for Public Service, already has MTAS, the Municipal Technical Advisory Service, and CTAS for counties that are already embedded in every city and county in the state and have offices statewide and have a presence. And then you also have the Center for Industrial Services that works directly with manufacturers across the state and a number of other agencies as well. And so that statewide presence, I think it lent the University of Tennessee very well to picking up that function. Land use planning and those kinds of things are not something that MTAS or CTAS had done as much of over the years. And so there's a niche there that the Center for Local Planning has been asked to go in there and fill.
In doing some background research on our conversation today, I found a quote you made when you were in Sumner County, and you said you really can't stop growth, you can only channel it. So expound on that a little bit.
Right. So in the state of Tennessee, I'll go further geographically. In the United States of America, people have a constitutional right to be able to make use of their property. And so government can only take that property with due process. That's I believe the Fifth Amendment of the U.S. Constitution. And so things like planning and zoning and all the rules that we have that surround that are constitutionally allowable ways for the government to to regulate land use in a way to achieve objectives related to the public health, safety, and welfare, public welfare. And so within the context of Tennessee, where you're having a lot of growth and things are changing very rapidly, you have zoning, you have regulations that you can put into place, and you have a comprehensive planning process. But you can't go across the state and say, we're not going to let you do anything with your land anymore. We're not going to let you develop property. You can't do blanket prohibitions on people's right to do legal things in terms of making use of their property. And so land use policies like zoning and subdivision regulations and comprehensive plans and those kinds of things, they essentially they take the market forces that are there that are encouraging development to occur, and you basically the local government is able to use those tools to make that development come out the way they want it to. If they want certain design, if they want certain setbacks, if they want certain new roads to be built to a certain standard, if they want landscaping to look a certain way, or drainage and detention and those kinds of things to be done in a certain way, when development comes in, development will follow those regulations, and that vision can be achieved. And so that's how development is able to be channeled. Working as a local planner for a long time, the infrastructure that gets built across the state of Tennessee in cities and counties is primarily built by development during the development process. And so having good standards can make sure that the roads are built in a way that they last a long time. And the water lines are being installed in ways that make sure that they function properly and are sized appropriately. And so those market forces essentially the zoning and land use regulation process. It channels those things into things that, again, help foster that public good, the public welfare.
And, not only in Tennessee, Josh, but across the country, we see those families that have been involved in farming for generations. And we all know that now it's not as generational as it used to be, because the young people grew up, they had other interests, they did not want to farm for a living, and they've moved off somewhere. And so we have this real dilemma that, farming has been in that family for generations, but the generations coming on don't want to be involved in farming. So, as you work through this with the UT Planning Office, and you talked about farm loss to development in Tennessee, what's you mentioned some of the things about a trust and this type of thing, but basically, is it mostly an educational process?
I think that's the biggest part of it, And, I don't know that there's a lot of desire on anybody's part that's in a leadership level at the state. Again, like I was saying earlier, to come in across the state and tell people that they can't make use of their property. If that family owns that piece of property and that family has made a decision on what they want to do with that property as a family, then within whatever the local regulations are and the context of all that, they should be allowed to do that. But I think the state has explored ways to incentivize more voluntary preservation of farmland through conservation easements and those kinds of things, and programs that they have to get young people into farming and keep them into farming and those kinds of things. And so it's things like when you talk about rural preservation or rural conservation or whatever you might want to call it. It's a difficult nut to crack sometimes, because the market forces that I was talking about are so strong. And the amount of money that's involved is so great sometimes. But when folks have a range of choices on if they want to keep the farm, if they want to continue to farm, trying to figure out ways to incentivize that is a positive thing to do.
And I think we're a perfect example of that where we're located, our organization dealing primarily with rural counties in southwest Tennessee. And then you have an announcement like was made here a few years ago that Ford Motor Company is building a plant in one of our rural counties, intends to employ about 6,000 people, and then you've got all the spin-offs from that, all the Tier 2 and Tier 3 manufacturers, retail coming in. As you would talk to some of our smaller rural communities, maybe the 1, 2, or 3 things, if you had a checklist, would you tell them, growth is coming, but this is really what you need to do?
Well, probably the most important thing that they can do is, if you're a city particularly, is take a hard look at your infrastructure, at what you can actually accommodate. And so that's something I've seen throughout my career is, sometimes comprehensive plans can be a visionary document it's kind of an aspirational kind of a thing. And that's great. But the plans that you make need to be tied to the reality of what can actually be done. And so, if you are a community that is looking to grow, wants to grow, if that's the vision of the community, having a sewer plant is unglamorous as that is, having a sewer plant that can actually accommodate that growth, and you having the ability to discharge from that sewer plant into a water source, as TDEC is going to require you to do, in the way they're going to require you to do it, that's very important. And so spending time on the front end looking at your infrastructure needs, what you have, what you'd like to have, and then figuring out a way to pay for that. If you do want to grow, great. But again, those problems I was talking about toward the beginning of our conversation, where you have a lot of growth that gets way out there ahead of everything, and then your sewer plant can't accommodate it. Your water system can't accommodate it, and that's when the state comes down. TDEC will often come down and impose a moratorium and say, "Hey, no more building permits until you can get this issue resolved with your sewer plant." And then things go into crisis mode where you're having to, issue debt. You're having to do all these things to upgrade the sewer plant and these kinds of issues. And lawsuits are being threatened because you're not allowing the development you've already approved. And so that's something that plays out a lot. It has played out a lot historically across the state in rapidly growing areas. And so I would say the time is now, and they're doing that. I know the economic and community development folks at the state are working with a lot of communities across West Tennessee on looking at their water and sewer infrastructure and what the needs are, and helping them to get their arms around that. But knowing within the vision of what the community wants to be, and knowing what your infrastructure needs are going to be, and mapping out a vision for how you actually achieve that. That's the biggie. That's the biggie that I would recommend everybody do.
And I would imagine, Josh, just going back to what you've been talking about, it probably forces our communities to look more regionally to solve some of these problems, just because of the financial burden that's involved with certain infrastructure. Do you see that that's maybe a trend now, is regional solutions?
Yeah, for sure. And that's something, as you know, I don't need to tell you this, but that's something that the Infrastructure Development District Act of 1964, I believe it was, that was encouraged by the state back then. And my experience in Middle Tennessee with the Greater Nashville Regional Council and other development districts that I've worked with in my capacity at TDOT and other places, those organizations are there and do a phenomenal job working across jurisdictional boundaries, which can be a challenge, as you know. But getting all those folks in the same room to have those conversations about, sometimes things like water lines and roads, they don't stop at the city limits line. They don't stop at the county line. And so figuring out those kinds of comprehensive plans for those kinds of improvements is incredibly important. And the development districts are in my opinion, the key facilitator of that across the state.
Well, and on behalf of the development districts, I want to thank you for your openness, for your willingness to work with us, because we have been in the trenches and planning for a lot of years. We're about out of time, but I did want to ask you, looking at the future of planning and all the advances in technology and AI that we talk about in every meeting we go to, do you see planning having a dramatic change in the future?
Well, the AI tools and those kinds of things are something that I think planners are, just like a lot of professions, people are working that into their workflow now. On things like public notice letters that have to go out and those kinds of things. A lot of communities are using AI to generate those automatically so that somebody doesn't have to manually type them in, little stuff like that. But I do think, no matter what changes technology-wise, it's still a people-centered line of work at the end of the day. And the local planners have got to be able to sit down at a table in person with their members of their planning commission and with the city council members or county commissioners that they work with. And like I was saying earlier, hear that vision that those people have for their community and help them, like we talked about, create policies that help to shape that growth that's coming in productive ways. And I don't see any technology coming along that takes that human element out of it. Out of that because it can be a very political process. And so having those relationships and with the leaders of the community and having relationships within the community so that you hear what people are talking about and you hear what is the mood of the community and the vision of the community and incorporating all that into the plans that you make. That's not going anywhere. And no matter what happens with the next data center that comes up.
Well, we need to always remember that there's another AI out there. We have artificial intelligence, but we need some actual intelligence too as we work on these issues. Our guest today has been Josh Suddath, who is the Executive Director of the Center for Local Planning with the University of Tennessee. Josh, if one of our listeners wants to find out more about the Center for Local Planning, I'm sure you've got a website they can go to.
Well, we're in the process of building that website right now. It should go live here in the next few days. But in the meantime, if anybody has any questions and wants to reach out to our office directly, we have a centralized email account that we're using, planning@tennessee.edu. And so any questions that anybody might have, that will come to me directly, and I'll be glad to do my best to get them an answer and look into anything they might want us to look into.
Great. Well, Josh is doing a great job. We look forward to working with him and his team. And again, I appreciate everyone tuning in to RuralStrong. If you want to contact us, you can email us at ruralstrong@gmail.com. Thanks for listening. Thanks for joining us on Rural Strong. If you found this helpful, share it and follow the show for more insights from rural leaders making a real difference. Until next time, stay rural strong.